It began with silence, the kind of silence that makes your heart beat louder than gunfire. Somewhere in the vast Egyptian desert, just outside a quiet railway stop called El Alamein, thousands of soldiers waited in the dark. No movement, no talking. Just the cold wind dragging sand across steel tanks and tired faces. But something was coming. By sunrise, this empty desert would become one of the deadliest battlegrounds in World War II. On one side stood the feared German commander, Erwin Rommel, a man whose tactics had already crushed armies across North Africa. They called him the Desert Fox. On the other side, a new force, calm, calculated, patient, led by Bernard Montgomery. 2 minds, 2 armies. One narrow stretch of land between the sea and deadly minefields. There was no room to retreat. This was not just another battle. This was the moment that would decide the fate of North Africa, and maybe the war itself. El Alamein was not chosen by accident. Look closely at the map, and you'll see the trap. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea stretched endlessly. To the south, an unforgiving depression, Qattara, so harsh that no tank could cross it. Between them, a narrow corridor of land. That corridor became a cage. For months, both sides had fought back and forth across North Africa. Cities fell, then were retaken. Nothing stayed won for long. But here, everything changed. The Axis forces, led by Erwin Rommel, had pushed deep into Egypt. Their goal was clear: capture the Suez Canal. If that happened, it would cripple British supply lines and possibly shift the entire balance of World War II. But the British had learned something important. They could not keep retreating. Under Bernard Montgomery, a new plan formed. Not a risky gamble, not a desperate charge. A slow, calculated buildup. Behind the front lines, thousands of troops, tanks, and artillery gathered silently. Supplies poured in. Weapons stacked high in the sand. Rommel thought he was advancing. He didn't realize he was walking straight into a wall. Then it happened. On the night of October 23, 1942, the silence shattered. Without warning, more than 1,000 guns opened fire at once. The desert sky lit up like daylight as shells screamed through the air. The ground trembled. Sand rose in waves. For miles, it felt like the earth itself was breaking apart. This was the beginning of the second Battle of El Alamein. The attack had a name, Operation Lightfoot, but there was nothing light about it. The plan was simple and terrifying. Infantry soldiers would move first, stepping carefully through enemy minefields. The mines were designed to explode under heavy vehicles, not footsteps. If they succeeded, they would clear narrow paths for tanks to follow. But simple didn't mean safe. In the darkness, soldiers advanced slowly, hearts racing, every step a gamble. One mistake, and the desert would erupt beneath them. Ahead of them, the Axis defenses waited, hidden guns, buried explosives, and soldiers ready to strike back. And somewhere in that chaos, Rommel's forces began to respond. The trap had been set. Now, it was springing shut. The moment the artillery slowed, the real nightmare began. Under flickering flares and burning skies, Allied infantry stepped forward into what soldiers called the Devil's Gardens, vast fields packed with thousands of hidden mines. Every inch of sand could kill. Men moved slowly, probing the ground with bayonets, hands shaking, eyes locked on the earth beneath them. One wrong step, and the silence would turn into fire. Some never even saw what hit them. Still, they kept moving. Behind them, engineers worked desperately, clearing narrow lanes through the chaos. These paths were the only hope for the tanks waiting in the darkness. If the lanes failed, the entire attack would collapse before it truly began. But the Axis forces were not blind. Machine guns opened up. Tracers cut through the night. Hidden artillery began to answer back. The desert filled with noise, shouts, explosions, and the sharp crack of gunfire echoing across the battlefield. What was meant to be a precise advance quickly turned into confusion. Units lost direction. Paths disappeared in the dust. Some soldiers found themselves deeper inside enemy lines than planned, with no way back. And as the night dragged on, one truth became clear. Breaking through would not be quick. It would be slow, brutal, and costly. At first, confusion spread through the Axis lines. The sudden explosion of artillery, the unexpected night assault, it caught many off guard. But this was not an army that broke easily. And this was not just any commander. When Erwin Rommel returned to the front, everything began to change. Known as the Desert Fox, Rommel understood one thing better than most: speed. Even in chaos, he could see opportunity. And now, he saw exactly where the Allies were trying to break through. He reacted fast. German and Italian units regrouped, forming defensive lines around the weak points. Tanks rolled forward through the dust, engines roaring, guns ready. Counterattacks began almost immediately. The desert, already burning from explosions, became a battlefield of steel. Allied tanks trying to push through the cleared paths suddenly faced heavy resistance. Some lanes were blocked. Others led straight into ambushes. The carefully planned advance was slowing down. Then came the real problem. The minefields weren't fully cleared. As tanks tried to move forward, explosions ripped through their formations. Some vehicles were destroyed before even reaching the enemy. Others were forced to stop, creating traffic jams under enemy fire. Rommel saw this and pressed harder. Wave after wave, Axis forces struck back, determined to hold the line. What was supposed to be a breakthrough was turning into a deadly stalemate. Back at headquarters, far from the explosions, but not from the pressure, Bernard Montgomery watched the reports come in. The news wasn't good. Progress was slow. Casualties were rising. The breakthrough everyone hoped for hadn't happened. Many commanders in his position might have panicked, ordered a full assault, thrown everything forward in one desperate push. But Montgomery didn't move like that. He was patient, calculated, almost stubborn. To him, this wasn't about speed, it was about certainty. He had studied Erwin Rommel long enough to know one thing: rushing would play right into his hands. Rommel thrived on fast, chaotic battles, so Montgomery chose something different. He slowed it down. Instead of forcing a breakthrough, he ordered his forces to hold pressure, wear the enemy down, and keep pushing in controlled steps. Artillery would continue pounding Axis positions. Small advances would replace big risks. It frustrated some officers, but Montgomery was thinking ahead. He wasn't trying to win the battle in one night. He was trying to break the enemy, piece by piece. And slowly, beneath the endless desert sky, the balance began to shift. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to change everything. Days passed, then nights, then more days. But nothing ended. The Battle of El Alamein had become something else entirely, a war of attrition. No quick victories, no dramatic breakthroughs, just grinding, endless pressure. Artillery thundered day and night, turning the desert into a permanent storm of dust and fire. Tanks clashed again and again, sometimes gaining a few meters, only to lose them hours later. Every inch of land came at a cost. For the Axis forces under Erwin Rommel, the situation was getting worse. Supplies were running low, fuel was scarce, reinforcements were limited, and in the desert, supply meant survival. Without fuel, tanks were useless. Without ammunition, even the strongest defenses could fall. Rommel knew it, but he had no choice. He had to hold the line. Meanwhile, Bernard Montgomery kept tightening the pressure. More troops, more guns, more attacks. Small, controlled, relentless. The Allies weren't trying to break through anymore. They were trying to exhaust the enemy completely, and slowly, it was working. The Axis line, once strong and confident, was beginning to crack. Then came the moment Montgomery had been waiting for. After days of pressure, he saw it, the weakness. The Axis line was thinning, supplies were nearly gone, morale was slipping. This was the crack, and now he would strike. The new assault had a name: Operation Supercharge. Unlike the earlier attacks, this one was designed to break everything open. Before dawn, Allied forces prepared in silence. Tanks lined up across the desert, engines humming low. Infantry stood ready behind them, exhausted but determined. Then, as the first light touched the horizon, they moved. This time, it was different. The artillery support was overwhelming. The coordination was tighter, and most importantly, the enemy was weaker. Allied tanks pushed forward with force, smashing into Axis defenses. Positions that once held strong began to collapse under the pressure. For Erwin Rommel, the situation was turning critical. His forces were stretched thin. Fuel shortages meant many tanks couldn't even move. Some units were forced to fight where they stood, with no hope of retreat. Still, they resisted. But resistance was no longer enough, because this wasn't just another attack. This was the breaking point. And then, it finally happened. The line broke. What had held for days under constant pressure suddenly gave way. Gaps opened across the Axis defenses, and through those gaps, Allied forces surged forward. Tanks rolled past destroyed positions. Infantry followed close behind, pushing deeper into enemy territory. The battlefield that once stood locked in a deadly stalemate was now moving, fast. For Erwin Rommel, the reality was clear. They could not hold anymore. With fuel nearly gone, and supplies exhausted, staying in place meant total destruction. One by one, orders were given. Units began to pull back, abandoning equipment, leaving behind guns, vehicles, and positions they had fought so hard to defend. It wasn't a planned withdrawal, it was survival. Meanwhile, Bernard Montgomery saw the moment and pushed harder. This was what he had waited for, not just a break, but a collapse. The Allies advanced relentlessly, turning retreat into pursuit. The desert that had trapped both armies was now swallowing one of them whole. And as the Axis forces fell back across North Africa, one truth became impossible to ignore. The tide of World War II had just changed. When the guns finally fell silent, the desert remained. But nothing else was the same. The Battle of El Alamein was over. And for the first time in a long while, the Allies had not just survived, they had won. A real victory. For months, the Axis forces had dominated North Africa, pushing forward with confidence under Erwin Rommel. But here, they were stopped, broken, forced into a retreat they would never fully recover from. Bernard Montgomery didn't celebrate wildly. That wasn't his style, but he knew what this meant. This wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point. Soon after, Allied forces would continue pushing west, while new invasions would begin from the opposite direction. The Axis grip on North Africa would collapse completely. And beyond the desert, the impact spread. Across the world, people began to believe something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Because if the Axis could be stopped here, they could be stopped anywhere. Years later, historians would look back at El Alamein and say it clearly. Before this battle, the Allies had rarely won. After it, everything changed. And it all happened in a place that looked empty. A silent desert that decided the fate of a war.